Hey everyone, this is the part 2 video of the turbo upgrade in my BMW E46, aka the Basket Case BMW. Now, if you haven't seen the first video, there's a link right up in the corner. But in part 1, we installed this turbo manifold. We also installed a custom motor mount, and we got the turbo bolted in. But of course, there is still plenty of other stuff to do. For example, this turbo has an internal wastegate, so we want to get the wastegate squared away. And also in this video, I want to build the exhaust. Or I should say, I want to make a downpipe from the turbo to the stock exhaust. Because once again, this is a budget turbo build. So to help keep the costs down, we're going to reuse much of the stock exhaust. Anyway, let's get started. Okay, so in part 1, we bought this turbo. We did a bunch of work to port the exhaust housing, and we ported the wastegate port. When we went to install this turbo, we found out it didn't fit. So we had to buy another one. So of course that means we need to do all that work on the exhaust housing and the wastegate on the new turbo as well. Let's talk about that. Okay, so like I mentioned in the previous video, I had to get another turbo because the other one didn't fit. And because of that, we need to redo the entire process of porting the exhaust housing and the wastegate port in this turbo. Since I already showed you that process in the last video, I'm just going to go through this really quick. But once again, the opening in the turbo is slightly smaller than the opening in the manifold. So we're going to port this a little bit. However, we cannot do a proper port job because the walls on this are kind of thin, and I'm worried that we might break through, or we might make the walls too thin. So instead, what we're going to do, we're just going to chamfer this edge to hopefully improve the flow a little bit. Also, inside here, I'm not sure if you can see it, but right there, that's the wastegate port. Now that port is a hole that basically goes straight through the casing like that. So as the exhaust gas goes out the turbo, it has to make a sharp 90-degree turn to go out that port. And this edge here, where it makes that turn, is a sharp edge. So I want to round this thing off so that when the wastegate opens, the air can make that turn down into the port. Okay, and here is the other end of the wastegate port. I put some marking compound on the wastegate flapper, so you can see there is plenty of room for improvement. That wastegate port is pretty small. Now, once again, the exhaust gases are coming out this way, so we want to focus on this area. Now once again, we need to have a bit of a lip for that flapper to seal against. So I'm going to leave maybe 1/8 of an inch all the way around here. And I'm going to lay back this part so it'll be easier for the exhaust gases to get out. And last but not least, the wastegate flapper can only open so far before it hits the back of the exhaust housing. So I'm going to cut a relief in here so the wastegate flapper can open up just a little bit more. Okay folks, the port work on the wastegate port is complete. And once again, I opened up this part of the wastegate port because the exhaust gas is going to be heading out this direction. We want to make it easier for the exhaust gas to get out into the exhaust pipe. Also, I cut that recess into the back of the exhaust housing. Once again, this is so that the wastegate flapper can open up a little bit more. I don't know exactly how much, but I don't know, maybe an extra 25 or 30%. And last but not least, we rounded off that leading edge going into the wastegate port, so once again the air can make that turn down into the wastegate. Okay, so these modifications to the exhaust housing on the turbo should help to reduce boost creep. Anyway, let's get this thing put back together and move on with the project. Okay, before we finish putting together the turbo, I want to demonstrate just how much we opened up that wastegate port. Now previously I could just barely get my pinky finger in there, but now my pinky finger fits with plenty of room. So, let's try another finger. Yeah, that one fits with room to spare also. Should we do the thumb? Let's do the thumb. Hey, not bad. Okay, so we've gone from pinky to thumb. Okay, let's talk about the wastegate actuator. So here we have the compressor housing from the turbo with the wastegate actuator mounting bracket on it. Here's the actuator that I'm going to use. Now if I just bolt it onto there, it's going to be oriented kind of like that. And unfortunately, that's going to make it stick out pretty far, and that's probably going to interfere with the motor mount. Ideally, I would want to move this back about an inch, and I also want to angle it more like that. So to make that happen, we need to do some cut and paste on that bracket. Okay, so here is the mounting bracket. You can see I made a line here and here. We're going to cut across here and across there. All this stuff in the middle is going away, and this piece will be welded directly to that piece. Okay, so the cut part of the cut and paste operation is done. Now we need to do the paste part. But actually we're just going to put a couple tack welds for now, because I want to test fit this to make sure it will actually work. Okay, Regis, this is my final answer. I had to do some trial and error to get this part of the bracket angled correctly so the actuator would be aimed at the wastegate. And actually I had to take some of the metal that I cut out of here and put it back in, but at a different angle. Anyway, this should now be good to go. Okay, so here is the wastegate actuator mounted on the turbo. Keep in mind the original mounting had the wastegate actuator right around here somewhere, and it was aiming up at an angle like that. So I had to clock the actuator, plus I had to change the angle from this to this. But now this will fit under the turbo manifold. Check it out. Okay, so we got the wastegate actuator mounting bracket cleaned up with a fresh coat of paint. Actually, here's the paint I used. It's the same stuff I used on the manifold because I had some left over. Anyway, let's get this thing back in the car. Okay, so I decided to install the turbo in pieces. To make things a little bit easier. So for example, I removed the compressor housing. I also removed the back part of the exhaust housing, basically just to get better access to the mounting hardware where it bolts to the manifold. Because even though this turbo fits, it still goes in sort of like playing Tetris. Okay, now that we have the wastegate setup figured out and we have the turbo reinstalled, let's talk about the exhaust. Okay, so we have the rest of the turbo installed. And speaking of Tetris, the V-band will not fit in the tiny little gap between the turbo and the bell housing right here. So I had to pre-install the V-band onto the this piece of the exhaust housing and install all of this as a single piece. Also, you see right here I marked it with a Sharpie marker. The exhaust is actually going to interfere with the bell housing on the transmission right here. So I'm going to have to give the transmission a shave and a haircut. Okay, so now we have ourselves a happy little notch. Now I just need to reinstall that back piece on the turbo and we can start thinking about the downpipe. Okay, we got some clearance. It's close, but it should be fine. Oh, and I figured out one weird trick for removing and installing the V-band. Actually, some of you guys were probably yelling at your screen earlier, but yeah, there we go. Okay, now let's think about that downpipe. Okay, so in this box, we have everything we need to make our turbo exhaust system, or at least the stuff we need to make the downpipe. Okay, so we have a piece of 2.5-inch stainless steel tubing, 304 stainless by the way. It's got a 45-degree bend and it's got a U-bend in it. It's also got some straight parts, so hopefully this will be enough to make our downpipe. Also, we've got a flex joint. We've got a Y adapter to connect our 2.5-inch pipe to the stock exhaust. Because once again, we're doing this on the cheap, so we're not doing a complete exhaust system. We're just going to tie the downpipe into the stock exhaust. Also, we've got a couple O2 sensor bungs. And we've got some stainless steel welding wire. This is flux core stainless steel wire because I'm using a flux core welder. And last but not least, since we are not TIG welding, we need to protect the back of the weld somehow, and we're going to use this stuff. Okay, so looking at the back of the turbo, I think I need a 45-degree bend coming right off the back of the turbo. So I think I'm going to take this and cut it right about there, and this will plug into the back of the turbo, and then we'll figure out the rest. Okay, change of plans. I think that 45-degree turn might be too gradual. I want a tighter turn, so I'm going to cut 45 out of this, and that will plug into the back of the turbo. Okay, time to do some welding. Once again, I'm going to be welding this with... Once again, I don't have the equipment to TIG weld or to back purge the welds. So I'm using this stuff instead. It comes in a powder form, and you're supposed to mix it with alcohol, so I got some denatured alcohol at the hardware store. We're going to mix this up, and it should make a putty that we can apply to the back side of the welds, and that will protect them from oxidation. Okay, so these are the worst welds ever. They're even bad for me. I'm not that great of a welder. I tried all kinds of different settings to try to make this stainless steel wire work, and nothing I tried was working. So at this point, I think I'm just going to put the mild steel wire back in the welder, and we can paint the welds. Okay, so we did this weld with the mild steel welding wire, and it's not pretty, but it's functional. These other welds with the stainless steel wire were not even functional. I had to grind it all off, and we're going to redo these with the mild steel welding wire. Fun times. Okay, moving on. We dropped the stock exhaust out of the car. We need to cut it right about there, and then we're going to attach our Y pipes to it, sort of like that. Okay, so here we have the Y pipe installed on the stock exhaust. And by the way, these two pipes had to be spread apart a little bit to fit in there. And to help make that happen, I had to cut out these reinforcing pieces here. Okay, so now we should be able to put the stock exhaust back in the car. Okay folks, we have our stock exhaust reinstalled in the car. I'm also test fitting the turbo downpipe, and so far everything looks pretty good. All I need to do now is weld in the O2 sensor bungs and finish welding these connections together, and the exhaust will be done. Okay, we have our O2 sensor bungs installed. Now all we need to do is connect this to the rest of the exhaust. Okay, so we dropped the exhaust out of the car one more time to finish up these welds here and here, and then the exhaust is complete. Okay, the welding is complete. Actually, off camera, I cleaned up all these welds and I gave it a fresh coat of paint. The paint that I used, once again, is this stuff, because I had some left over. Anyway, we're going to let this stuff dry overnight and reinstall the exhaust for the final time. Okay folks, the exhaust system is complete. Now once again, coming right off the turbo, we have a 45-degree angle. Well, it's actually more like 47 or 48 degrees. Then we have our O2 bungs. This one is for the ECU. This one is for the wideband gauge. We have another 45 to level out the pipe. Once again, it's more like 47 or 48 degrees. Then we have our flexible coupling. We have our Y pipe connecting to the stock exhaust. And from here on back, it is the stock exhaust. Well, with one exception. I mean, I deleted the mufflers a while back. But you get the idea. So, I think this is a good spot to end the video, and I'll see you next time.